Have you ever had your heart broken by the person you sacrificed everything to raise? Imagine spending your life nurturing a child, only to have her slam the door in your face and keep your beloved grandchildren from you. Until suddenly, she discovers she needs the money you control. That's what happened to me. My name is Katherine Bennett, and this is how my only daughter, Claire, cut me out of my grandchildren's lives until she discovered she needed access to the trust fund their grandfather had wisely placed in my care. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. It was a crisp autumn morning in Riverside when the realization finally hit me like a physical blow. I stood at my kitchen window, watching golden leaves spiral down from the maple trees that lined my garden, and admitted to myself what I had been denying for months. I was being systematically erased from my grandchildren's lives. I had been a widow for nearly 3 years by then. My husband, Edward, had been taken suddenly by a heart attack while tending to the rosebushes he loved so dearly in our backyard. We'd built our lives in this Victorian home on Sycamore Street, the same home where we'd raised our only daughter, Claire. Edward had been an investment banker with a shrewd mind for finances, while I had dedicated my career to medicine, eventually becoming head of pediatrics at Riverside Memorial before retiring. We weren't extraordinarily wealthy, but Edward's careful investments had given us comfort and security. For Claire, he'd often say as he reviewed his portfolio, and especially for her children. Edward had always believed in planning generations ahead. After losing Edward, my grandchildren became my world. 11-year-old Abigail with her serious eyes and brilliant mind, and 7-year-old Max with his infectious laugh and endless questions about everything under the sun. They were my anchors in the storm of grief. Every Monday and Friday afternoon, I'd collect them from their private school, bring them to my house for homemade cookies, oatmeal chocolate chip for Abigail, snickerdoodles for Max, and help with homework or science projects. On warmer days, we'd go to Oakwood Park where Max would scramble over the playground equipment while Abigail and I sat beneath the big oak tree reading novels together or discussing the latest exhibit at the Riverside Natural History Museum. Those precious afternoons twice a week had become my lifeline after Edward passed. Until they weren't anymore. It started subtly enough. Claire called one Monday morning, her voice apologetic but firm. "Mom, I'm sorry, but Abigail has an important piano audition this afternoon. We need to skip today's visit. Her instructor insists she needs these final hours to practice." Of course, I understood. My granddaughter was gifted musically, something she'd inherited from Edward's side of the family. "No problem at all, sweetheart," I assured Claire. "We'll make it up on Friday." But Friday brought another call. Max had suddenly been invited to a classmate's birthday party that couldn't possibly be missed. It was at the new virtual reality arcade after all, and all the boys will be there. The following Monday, both children had dentist appointments. Friday, they'd enrolled in a special coding workshop. One cancellation became 2, then 3, then morphed into a pattern I couldn't ignore. When I did manage to see the children, Claire would invariably appear within 45 minutes, claiming they needed to rush off to some lesson or activity she'd forgotten to mention earlier. Our leisurely afternoons of baking, crafts, and conversations dwindled to hurried half-hours under Claire's watchful gaze. "Is everything all right?" I finally asked my daughter during a rare moment alone, as the children gathered their belongings. Claire had become a successful corporate attorney, following in neither my nor Edward's footsteps, but carving her own path with the determined independence she'd shown since childhood. Claire smoothed her already perfect hair, a gesture so reminiscent of her teenage years that it momentarily transported me back in time. "Everything's fine, Mom. Why do you ask?" "I've barely seen Abigail and Max lately," I said carefully. "Their schedules seem suddenly packed with new activities." "That's modern parenting," Claire replied with a tight smile. "Kids need structured enrichment these days. Competition for top universities starts early. Abigail is already being groomed for Phillips Exeter. And Max needs to develop his STEM skills if he's going to keep up. I nodded, not wanting to criticize her parenting. Perhaps I was being selfish, wanting their time for myself when they had so many opportunities to pursue. But something felt off. When we did have our abbreviated visits, the children seemed subdued, less willing to share details of their lives. Abigail, once so animated about her scientific discoveries and literary adventures, gave clipped responses to my questions. Max no longer bounded into my arms when I arrived. Then came the dinner that changed everything. I'd been invited to Claire and her husband Peter's contemporary home in Oak Ridge Heights for a Sunday meal, something that had once been a weekly tradition but had become increasingly rare. I'd baked Abigail's favorite lemon squares and brought a new dinosaur encyclopedia for Max. Their house was immaculate as always. Claire had inherited Edward's eye for design, and their home looked like something from an architectural magazine. Beautiful, but somehow untouchable. No fingerprints on the glass tables. No toys visible in the pristine white living room, though. I knew they must exist somewhere. Dinner was pleasant enough on the surface. Peter spoke mostly about his latest projects in commercial real estate development. Claire discussed a high-profile case she was working on. The children were quiet, answering questions about school with careful, rehearsed-sounding responses. I thought we might visit the new butterfly pavilion at the Botanical Gardens next weekend, I suggested during dessert. They've brought in species from South America that are only here for the month. Max, I remember how fascinated you were by metamorphosis in your science unit last year. A silence fell over the table. Claire and Peter exchanged a quick glance. Actually, Mom, Claire said, her voice gentle but unyielding, we've been meaning to talk to you about the children's schedule. Peter cleared his throat. They're both involved in so many activities now. Abigail has her piano competitions and the advanced mathematics program on weekends. Max is starting travel soccer and has his robotics club. We think it might be easier if we pause the regular visits for a while, Claire continued, just until things settle into a rhythm. Maybe we could do monthly Sunday dinners here instead, where the children are comfortable in their routine. The homemade apple pie I'd brought turned tasteless in my mouth. Paused? But the children and I have always had our Mondays and Fridays. They're just getting so overwhelmed, Claire explained, her tone suggesting I was being unreasonable. And, frankly, Mom, they come home from your house with ideas that, well, that aren't always aligned with our parenting philosophy. I looked at her in confusion. What do you mean? Last week, Max came home talking about how you'd told him it was okay to get B's in school if he was trying his best, Claire said, the disapproval evident in her voice. Peter and I have been very clear that in this family, we aim for excellence. A's are the expectation. And you've been filling Abigail's head with stories about your emergency room days, Peter added. Now she's saying she might want to be a doctor instead of an attorney. We've been grooming her for pre-law since she was 8. I glanced at my grandchildren. Abigail was staring at her plate, but I caught the slight tremble in her lower lip. Max was blinking rapidly, the way he always did when trying not to cry. But Grandma always helps me understand fractions better than my tutor, Max said in a small voice. Claire smoothed his hair. You'll still see Grandma, sweetheart. Just not as often. And look at all the exciting new activities you get to do instead. I drove home that night with tears threatening to spill over. What had I done wrong? Was I truly disrupting their carefully cultivated path to success? I'd always prided myself on being a supportive presence in their lives, not an obstacle to their development. The regular visits officially ended. They were replaced with carefully choreographed monthly dinners at their house, where I felt more like an acquaintance than a grandmother. Twice I suggested taking the children to a museum exhibit afterward. Twice Claire had excuses ready. My son-in-law Mark, Claire's husband's brother who had always been close to our family, was outraged when I finally confided in him during a coffee meeting. That's ridiculous, Katherine. Those kids adore you. Claire, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Is controlling everything as usual. There must be a reason, I said, still trying to be fair. Maybe they really are overscheduled. Mark, who worked as a financial advisor, looked thoughtful. Have you considered there might be another motivation here? What do you mean? I asked, stirring my untouched coffee. Well, he said carefully, you mentioned Edward set up trusts for the grandchildren. How exactly are those structured? The question caught me off guard. In my grief after Edward died, I'd let many financial details slide. Our longtime accountant handled bill payments, and I trusted that everything was functioning as Edward had arranged. He had mentioned provisions for the grandchildren, but I couldn't recall the specifics. I'm not entirely sure, I admitted. Edward handled all that. Mark nodded thoughtfully. It might be worth looking into, just to be thorough. That night, I couldn't sleep. Mark's suggestion nagged at me relentlessly. Could there possibly be a connection between my reduced access to my grandchildren and whatever financial arrangements Edward had made? It seemed far-fetched, almost offensive, to consider. Claire and Peter were both successful professionals with excellent incomes. What could they possibly want with whatever modest provisions Edward had made? Still, the next morning, I found myself drawn to Edward's study. I'd barely entered the room since his death, finding the space too painful, too filled with him. His reading glasses still sat on the desk where he'd left them. The leather chair still held the impression of his form. With a deep breath, I sat down and began opening drawers. Edward had been meticulously organized in all things, everything labeled and filed with precision. It didn't take long to find a folder marked Grandchildren's Trusts. As I read through the documents, my hands began to tremble. Edward had been far more prudent than I'd realized. He'd established substantial trust funds for both Abigail and Max, using a portion of his life insurance and investments. The trusts were designed primarily for education and health care, with larger sums to be released when they reached certain milestones, 18, 21, and 25. And there, in black and white, was the detail that made my heart race. I, Katherine Bennett, was named as the sole trustee until the children turned 25, with full discretionary authority over disbursements. Claire couldn't access a penny of these funds without my approval. I sat back, my mind reeling. Could this really be why I was being gradually pushed out of my grandchildren's lives? Was Claire hoping I'd remain ignorant of my position as trustee? Or was she strategically keeping me at arm's length until she needed something? I wasn't a suspicious person by nature. I'd always tried to see the best in others, especially family. But the timing was difficult to ignore. According to Peter's casual mention during our last dinner, they had recently enrolled Abigail in an elite music conservatory program with a substantial tuition. Max was seeing a specialized educational psychologist for what Claire called optimizing his learning potential, that their insurance only partially covered. These were exactly the kinds of expenses the trusts were designed to address. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was Claire. My heart jumped. Perhaps she was calling to invite me to see the children, but her voice was all business. Mom, I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Peter and I were hoping you might be free for dinner this Friday, just adults. We have something important to discuss. Is everything all right? I asked, wondering if she somehow knew what I'd just discovered. Everything's fine, she assured me, though her tone was strained. Just some family matters we'd like your input on. After hanging up, I called Mark immediately. They've invited me to dinner without the children to discuss family matters, I told him. This can't be a coincidence. It probably isn't, Mark agreed. Katherine, I know this is difficult, but I think you need to be prepared for them to ask for access to those trust funds, and you need to decide before you go what your conditions will be. conditions. The word felt harsh, transactional. These were my family members, not business associates. But as I thought about the past few months, the canceled visits, the supervised interactions, the gradual erasure of my role in my grandchildren's lives, I felt a resolve hardening within me. If Claire wanted access to the funds Edward had, so carefully set aside for our grandchildren, she would need to respect my place in their lives as well. Friday arrived, and I dressed with care in a blue cashmere sweater that Edward had given me for our last anniversary together. I brought a bottle of the Pinot Noir that Peter favored, determined to begin the evening on a positive note despite my inner turmoil. Claire answered the door looking polished and perfect as always, her blonde hair falling in a sleek bob, wearing a cream silk blouse that probably cost more than my entire outfit. "Mom, thank you for coming," she said, kissing my cheek lightly. "Peter's just finishing some work emails. Come in." The house felt emptier without the children. "Are Abigail and Max already in bed?" I asked, though it was barely 7 p.m. "They're having a sleepover at my colleague's house," Claire replied smoothly. Her children are in the same grade. We thought it would be nice to have an adult conversation without interruptions. Of course. Heaven forbid I might actually see my grandchildren during this visit. Peter emerged from his home office, looking tired but managing a warm smile. "Katherine, thanks for coming." His hug felt genuine at least. For all his faults, I believed Peter loved me. He had always been more like Edward, a peacekeeper who preferred to avoid conflict even when it meant yielding to stronger personalities. Claire, with her attorney's determination and clarity, had easily become the decision-maker in their marriage. Dinner was Claire's signature roast chicken, accompanied by an expensive bottle of wine Peter had been saving for a special occasion. The conversation remained light through the first course. Neighborhood gossip, Peter's latest development project, Claire's recent court victory. But I could feel the underlying tension, the careful avoidance of whatever family matter had prompted this dinner. Finally, as Claire served tiramisu for dessert, Peter cleared his throat. "Katherine, we wanted to talk to you about something important." I set down my fork and waited. "It's about the children's education," Claire began, her voice carefully modulated. "As you know, Abigail's musical talent has been recognized by the Riverside Conservatory. Their accelerated program is an incredible opportunity. Their graduates perform with symphonies around the world. She's already flourishing there." I nodded. I hadn't actually known about this program since no one had bothered to tell me, but I kept that to myself. "And Max," Peter continued, "has been working with Dr. Levinson for his cognitive development. He's made tremendous progress." Again, news to me. Max had always been a bright, curious child, but no one had mentioned any specialized intervention. "That all sounds wonderful," I said carefully. "I'm happy they're getting the support they need." Claire and Peter exchanged glances. "The thing is," Peter said, looking uncomfortable, "these expenses are significant. The conservatory's tuition is substantial, and Dr. Levinson doesn't take insurance." "We're managing," Claire added quickly. "But we've been thinking about the children's future. College costs are only going to increase, and we want to make sure they have every advantage." Here it comes, I thought. "We recently met with our financial advisor," Peter continued, "and he mentioned that Dad might have set up some kind of educational trust for the kids. We thought you might know about it." I took a slow sip of water, collecting my thoughts. They were trying to be casual, as if this wasn't the entire reason for the dinner party, as if they hadn't been systematically reducing my role in their lives while suddenly developing an interest in whatever financial arrangements Edward had made. "Yes," I said finally. "Edward did establish trusts for both Abigail and Max." Claire's eyes lit up, though she quickly composed her expression. "That's wonderful news. Dad was always so thoughtful about the future." "He was," I agreed. "He wanted to make sure his grandchildren would have support for their education and healthcare needs. Peter leaned forward eagerly. Do you know how we would access those funds for the conservatory tuition, for instance? I met his gaze steadily. I'm the trustee, Peter. Any disbursements would need to be approved by me. The room went silent. Claire's smile froze on her face. You're the trustee? Peter repeated, sounding surprised. I assumed it would be both, of you, or maybe the bank. I shook my head. Edward was very specific. He named me as sole trustee until the children turned 25. Claire set down her wine glass with a slightly too forceful click against the table. Well, that's unexpected, but I'm sure you'll want to help with Abigail's conservatory tuition. The program is preparing her for an extraordinary future. And Max's sessions with Dr. Levinson, Peter added, they're making such a difference. I took a deep breath. I'm happy to consider any expenses that benefit my grandchildren. Edward set up these trusts precisely for educational and health needs. Wonderful, Claire said, visibly relaxing. If you could just transfer the tuition amount to our account, we can take care of the payments directly. It's due quarterly. I'll need to see the enrollment documentation, I said calmly. And for Max's therapy, I'd like to meet with Dr. Levinson to understand the treatment plan. The trust requires me to keep records of all disbursements. Claire's smile tightened. That seems unnecessary. We can just forward you the bills. I'm afraid that's not how it works, I replied. As trustee, I have a fiduciary responsibility to understand exactly how the funds are being used. Edward was very clear about that. Peter jumped in, clearly sensing his wife's growing irritation. Mom, we're not asking you to just hand over the money. We're talking about our children's education and health. I understand that, I said. And I'm more than happy to support both. But there's something else we need to discuss. I set down my napkin and looked directly at Claire. I've barely seen Abigail and Max in months. Every attempt I make to spend time with them is canceled or cut short. If I'm to fulfill my responsibilities as trustee, understanding their needs, and ensuring the funds are used appropriately, I need to actually be part of their lives. Claire's cheeks flushed. Are you suggesting that we're only interested in the trust money? That's insulting, Mom. I'm not suggesting anything, I replied, keeping my voice level. I'm simply stating two facts. I have a responsibility as trustee to be involved in decisions about my grandchildren's education and welfare, and I've been systematically prevented from spending time with them for months now. Both of these situations need to change. Peter looked pained. Mom, it's not like that. We've just been trying to establish routines, maintain consistency for the kids. Then perhaps we should establish a new routine, I suggested. One that includes regular, unsupervised time with their grandmother. The same grandmother who's being asked to fund their education and health care. Claire pushed her chair back slightly. So you're using your position as trustee to force your way back into our family schedule? That's manipulative, Mom. The accusation stung, but I held my ground. No more manipulative than suddenly inviting me to dinner to discuss the trust funds after months of keeping me at arm's length. The facade of pleasantry shattered. Claire stood up, her expression cold. I think it's time for you to leave. Peter looked horrified. Claire, wait! But Claire was already walking toward the front door, her back rigid with anger. I gathered my purse and cardigan. I'm sorry it came to this, I told Peter, who looked torn between following his wife and apologizing to me. I love Abigail and Max more than anything. All I want is to be part of their lives. The money was never meant to be a weapon. It was Edward's gift to ensure their future. Mom, Peter began, but Claire called his name sharply from the hallway, and he fell silent. I left their beautiful house with a heavy heart, but a newfound clarity. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside, I realized the power dynamics in our family had just fundamentally shifted. For months, I had been the one seeking approval, trying to accommodate Claire's increasingly restrictive boundaries, grateful for whatever crumbs of time with my grandchildren I was allowed. Now, with the discovery of my role as trustee, the scales had tipped. Claire needed something from me, something significant. The question was, would she recognize that maintaining a loving relationship between grandchildren and grandmother was in everyone's best interest? Or would this revelation only deepen the rift between us? When I reached my empty house, I sat in the darkened car for several minutes, too emotionally drained to move. On the passenger seat lay a small gift bag containing the presents I'd brought for Abigail and Max, a set of watercolor pencils for her, a build-your-own robot kit for him, presents I hadn't been able to give because, once again, they had been kept from me. My phone buzzed with a text message from Mark. How did dinner go? I couldn't bring myself to type out the whole story. Instead, I simply wrote, "They want the trust money. Everything's changed now." His response came seconds later. "Coming to visit tomorrow. Don't do anything until we talk." I smiled faintly at his protective instinct. Mark had always been the fighter in the family, quick to defend those he loved. Claire, like her father, preferred harmony at all costs, unless, of course, she was the one creating the discord. Inside the house, I went straight to Edward's study and retrieved the trust documents, spreading them across the kitchen table. I needed to understand exactly what powers and responsibilities I had. If Claire and Peter were going to treat this as a business transaction, I needed to be fully informed. The language of the trust documents was complex, filled with legal terminology that made my head swim, but the essential facts were clear. As trustee, I had significant discretion over how and when the funds were dispersed. The trust specified educational and healthcare expenses as primary purposes, but also allowed for other expenditures that I determined to be in the best interest of the beneficiaries. I had both legal rights and responsibilities. I couldn't simply withhold funds out of spite. That would be a violation of my fiduciary duty. But I could establish reasonable conditions and expectations around communication and involvement. As I read deeper into the documents, something else caught my eye. There was a provision I hadn't noticed before. In the event that I was unable or unwilling to serve as trustee, the role would pass not to Claire, but to Mark, Peter's brother. Edward had clearly anticipated potential conflicts and taken steps to ensure the trusts would be managed according to his wishes, even if family dynamics became complicated. Knowing Edward, this wasn't an oversight or a slight against our daughter. He had simply recognized Claire's tendency toward control and materialism, traits that had emerged in her college years and strengthened with her professional success. Edward had loved Claire dearly, but had no illusions about her character. I closed the folder, my resolve strengthening. This wasn't about using money as leverage to see my grandchildren. This was about restoring balance to a relationship that had become increasingly one-sided. Claire needed to understand that we were family, not just when she wanted financial support, but always. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and decisions. For tonight, I allowed myself to feel the hurt of being pushed aside, of missing precious months of my grandchildren's lives. I opened my phone to the last photos I had of them. Abigail proudly holding her science fair ribbon. Max, with chocolate, ice cream smeared across his gleeful face. Their childhood was flying by and I was missing it. Not anymore, I whispered to the quiet house. Not if I can help it. The morning after that disastrous dinner, I awoke to 5 missed calls from Peter. No voicemails, just calls at increasingly late hours, the last one at nearly midnight. I wasn't ready to speak with him yet, not until I'd sorted through my own thoughts and spoken with Mark. I made my morning tea and carried it out to the back patio where Edward and I had spent so many peaceful mornings watching the birds flit around our garden. The Japanese maple he had planted on our 30th anniversary was turning a brilliant crimson. He would have loved to see it. My phone buzzed again. Peter. With a deep breath, I answered. Katherine. Finally. I've been trying to reach you." His voice sounded strained, exhausted. "I was asleep," I said simply. "It's early, Peter." He sighed, the sound crackling through the line. "About last night, things got out of hand." "Yes, they did. Claire was upset. She feels like you're holding the trust over our heads." I took a slow sip of tea before responding. "Is that what you think too?" A pause. I think everyone's intentions got lost. We want what's best for the kids, and I know you do too." "Of course I do. That's why Edward established those trusts, to ensure their future." "Look, Katherine, I'm sorry if we've been restrictive about visits lately. Things have just been hectic, but using the trust as leverage—" "I'm not using anything as leverage, Peter," I interrupted, my patience wearing thin. "I'm stating two facts. I am the legally appointed trustee of your children's trusts, and I have been systematically excluded from their lives. Both of these things are true, and both need to be addressed." I took a breath, then continued. "Peter, do you even know how long it's been since I've been allowed a full afternoon with Abigail and Max? Do you know that the last 3 times I brought them presents, Claire forgot to have them open them while I was there? Do you know that Abigail's music teacher asked her why her grandmother never comes to her recitals anymore, and Abigail said it was because I don't care enough?" My voice cracked on the last sentence. I hadn't meant to reveal that. Meredith, the mother of one of Abigail's friends, had told me about my granddaughter's comment after speaking with the music teacher at a community fundraiser. There was silence on the other end of the line. I didn't know that," Peter finally said, his voice smaller. "No, I don't suppose you did." I gathered myself, determined not to let emotion overrule reason. "Peter, I'm not withholding funds out of spite. I'm saying that as trustee, I have both a right and a responsibility to be involved in decisions about the children's education and welfare. That's not manipulation. It's the literal purpose of a trustee." "What exactly are you asking for, Katherine?" "Regular, unsupervised time with my grandchildren. The same schedule we had before, Mondays and Fridays after school. Information about their education and activities, inclusion in important decisions, and events." I paused. "Basically, I'm asking to be their grandmother again, not just a signature on a check." Peter was quiet for so long I thought we might have been disconnected. Finally, he said, "I'll talk to Claire." "You do that?" I replied, then added more gently, "I love you, Peter, and I love those children more than anything. I just want to be part of their lives." "I know, Katherine," he said, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. "I'll call you later." After hanging up, I called Mark to fill him in on the dinner fiasco and Peter's morning call. My son-in-law's brother's reaction was predictably protective. "Unbelievable," he fumed. "So they've been freezing you out for months, and the minute they need money, suddenly they want a relationship? And then they have the nerve to accuse you of manipulation?" "That about sums it up," I said. "Uncle Edward was right to make you the trustee," Mark declared. "He must have foreseen something like this." "I don't think even Edward could have predicted this particular scenario," I said with a sad smile. "But he did understand people's characters. He knew Claire would always put her own priorities first." "So what now?" Mark asked. "Now we wait." Peter said he'd talk to Claire. I made my position clear. I'm happy to fulfill my duties as trustee, which include paying for legitimate educational and healthcare expenses, but I expect to be included in their lives again. Mark snorted. "Good luck with that. Claire won't give up control easily." He was right. The rest of the day passed without word from Peter or Claire. I distracted myself with volunteering at the hospital's pediatric wing, then met Meredith for lunch at Riverside Cafe, carefully not checking, my phone every 5 minutes like a teenager waiting for a call. It was nearly dinner time when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Claire standing on my porch alone, her usual polished appearance slightly frayed at the edges, hair not quite perfectly styled, a faint smudge on the sleeve of her navy blazer. Claire, I said, genuinely surprised. Please, come in. She stepped inside, her movements stiff. We stood awkwardly in my entryway for a moment before I gestured toward the living room. Would you like some tea? Or something stronger? No, thank you, she replied, seating herself on the edge of the sofa. I won't stay long. I sat in Edward's old armchair across from her, waiting. Claire crossed her legs, then uncrossed them. Peter told me about your conversation this morning. I nodded but said nothing. I want to be clear about something, she continued, her voice tightly controlled. I have never intentionally kept the children from you. We've simply been establishing boundaries and routines that work for our family. I bit back a dozen retorts, letting her continue. That said, I recognize that you are the children's grandmother, and they do love you. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her slacks. And as trustee of their educational funds, you obviously have an interest in their schooling. I have an interest in their entire lives, Claire, not just their education, I said quietly. Her jaw tightened momentarily. Of course. What I'm saying is, perhaps we can find a compromise that works for everyone. I'm listening. Claire pulled a small leather planner from her purse. I've been looking at our schedule. The children have activities most days after school, but we could arrange for you to have them every other Saturday from noon until 5. Every other Saturday for 5 hours? I couldn't keep the dismay from my voice. Claire, that's less time than I had before. It's consistent time, she countered. Guaranteed on the calendar. No last-minute cancellations. What about school functions? Recitals? Science fairs? Sports events? She hesitated. We'll make sure. You're informed about those. You can attend if you wish. I studied her face, noting the careful calculation behind her expression. This wasn't a peace offering. It was a business proposal. And in exchange for this generous visitation schedule, you'd like me to release funds for Abigail's conservatory, tuition and Max's sessions with Dr. Levinson? I asked, not bothering to hide my sarcasm. Claire flushed. This isn't a transaction, Mom. I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. No, you're trying to give up as little as possible. While getting what you want, I said flatly. 5 hours every other week isn't being a grandmother, Claire. It's being an occasional visitor. What exactly do you want then? She asked, frustration edging into her voice. I want what I had before. Mondays and Fridays after school, regular, phone calls with the children, inclusion in special events, the ability to take them places without supervision like any normal grandmother would. Claire's expression hardened. That's disruptive to their routine. They have piano on Mondays, and Max has his cognitive development sessions on Fridays now. Then Tuesdays and Thursdays, or weekends. I'm flexible on the days, Claire. What I'm not flexible on is being treated like an outsider in my grandchildren's lives. We stared at each other across the coffee table, two women locked in a battle of wills that was ostensibly about schedules, but really about so much more. About power, about family, about what constituted love. I'll have to discuss this with Peter, she finally said. Yes, please do. And while you're discussing, you might want to consider this. I leaned forward. The trust doesn't just cover tuition and therapy expenses. It's meant for anything that benefits the children's welfare and development. Piano lessons, summer camps, college visits eventually, even family vacations that have educational value. As trustee, I'll need to be involved in all those decisions too. Claire stood abruptly. This conversation is over. I came here in good faith, Mom. No, you came here to see how little you could offer while still getting access to the trust, I replied, rising as well. That's not good faith. That's negotiation. And if we're negotiating, you should know my terms aren't negotiable. I want a real relationship with my grandchildren, not a scheduled visitation. You're impossible, she snapped, gathering her purse. I'm their grandmother, I corrected, and I'm not going anywhere. After Claire stormed out, I sat back down, my hands trembling slightly. Confrontation had never been my strong suit. That had been Edward's department when necessary, his quiet authority often resolving conflicts before they escalated. But some things were worth fighting for, and my relationship with Abigail and Max absolutely was. My phone pinged with a text from Mark. "Any news?" Claire offered every other Saturday for 5 hours. I declined, I replied. Mark's response was immediate. "Good. Hold your ground. The law firm I consult with says legally they don't have a leg to stand on." I wasn't sure if that was comforting or not. I didn't want this to become a legal battle. I wanted it to be a family reconciliation. But Claire's visit had made one thing clear. She saw this purely as a transaction, a power struggle to be won or lost. 3 days passed with no word from either Claire or Peter. I tried to focus on my hospital volunteer work, on my book club, on anything but the ache of missing my grandchildren. Then on the 4th day, as I was sorting through medical supplies we'd collected for an overseas mission, my cell phone rang. It was from Abigail's school. "Dr. Bennett? This is Principal Winters from Oak Ridge Academy. There's been an accident. During PE class. Abigail has injured her arm, possibly broken. We've been trying to reach her parents, but we haven't been successful. You're listed as the emergency contact." My heart raced. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. At the school, I found Abigail in the nurse's office, pale and trying not to cry, her arm carefully immobilized in a temporary sling. The school nurse looked relieved to see me. "We've been trying to reach her parents," she explained. "Mrs. Wilson's phone goes straight to voicemail, and Mr. Wilson isn't answering." "Claire is in court today on an important case," I recalled. "And Peter might be at the site of his new development where reception is spotty. I'm authorized to take Abigail for medical care." This wasn't strictly confirmed in our current arrangement, but it was a medical emergency, and I wasn't about to leave my granddaughter in pain while we sorted out Claire's permission protocols. "You're listed as an emergency contact," the nurse confirmed. "That's sufficient." I drove Abigail to the ER, holding her uninjured hand while she fought back tears. "It really hurts, Grandma," she admitted quietly. "I know, sweetheart. We'll get it fixed up soon." I kept my voice calm and reassuring, though inside I was seething that neither parent was reachable during a school day. At the hospital, where I'd worked for over 30 years before retiring, I was greeted by name by several staff members, which seemed to comfort Abigail. I finally managed to reach Peter, who was indeed at his development site. "Katherine, thank God you were available. I'll get there as soon as I can, but it'll be at least an hour." I gathered myself, determined not to let emotion overrule reason. "Peter, I'm not withholding funds out of spite. I'm saying that as trustee, I have both a right and a responsibility to be involved in decisions about the children's education and welfare. That's not manipulation. It's the literal purpose of a trustee. What exactly are you asking for, Katherine?" "Regular, unsupervised time with my grandchildren. The same schedule we had before, Mondays and Fridays after school. Information about their education and activities. Inclusion in important decisions. And events." I paused. "Basically, I'm asking to be their grandmother again, not just a signature on a check." Peter was quiet for so long I thought we might have been disconnected. Finally, he said, "I'll talk to Claire." "You do that," I replied, then added more gently, "I love you, Peter, and I love those children more than anything. I just want to be part of their lives." "I know, Katherine," he said, and I could hear the weariness in his voice. "I'll call you later." After hanging up, I called Mark to fill him in on the dinner fiasco and Peter's morning call. My son-in-law's brother's reaction was predictably protective. "Unbelievable," he fumed. "So they've been freezing you out for months, and the minute they need money, suddenly they want a relationship, and then they have the nerve to accuse you of manipulation." "That about sums it up," I said. "Uncle Edward was right to make you the trustee," Mark declared. "He must have foreseen something like this." "I don't think even Edward could have predicted this particular scenario," I said with a sad smile. But he did understand people's characters. He knew Claire would always put her own priorities first. So what now? Mark asked. Now we wait. Peter said he'd talk to Claire. I made my position clear. I'm happy to fulfill my duties as trustee, which include paying for legitimate educational and healthcare expenses, but I expect to be included in their lives again. Mark snorted. Good luck with that. Claire won't give up control easily. He was right. The rest of the day passed without word from Peter or Claire. I distracted myself with volunteering at the hospital's pediatric wing, then met Meredith for lunch at Riverside Cafe, carefully not checking my phone every 5 minutes like a teenager waiting for a call. It was nearly dinner time when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Claire standing on my porch alone, her usual polished appearance slightly frayed at the edges, hair not quite perfectly styled, a faint smudge on the sleeve of her navy blazer. Claire, I said, genuinely surprised. Please? Come in. She stepped inside, her movement stiff. We stood awkwardly in my entryway for a moment before I gestured toward the living room. Would you like some tea? Or something stronger? No, thank you, she replied, seating herself on the edge of the sofa. I won't stay long. I sat in Edward's old armchair across from her, waiting. Claire crossed her legs, then uncrossed them. Peter told me about your conversation this morning. I nodded but said nothing. I want to be clear about something, she continued, her voice tightly controlled. I have never intentionally kept the children from you. We've simply been establishing boundaries and routines that work for our family. I bit back a dozen retorts, letting her continue. That said, I recognize that you are the children's grandmother, and they do love you. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her slacks. And as trustee of their educational funds, you obviously have an interest in their schooling. I have an interest in their entire lives, Claire, not just their education, I said quietly. Her jaw tightened momentarily. Of course. What I'm saying is, perhaps we can find a compromise that works for everyone. I'm listening. Claire pulled a small leather planner from her purse. I've been looking at our schedule. The children have activities most days after school, but we could arrange for you to have them every other Saturday from noon until 5. Every other Saturday for 5 hours. I couldn't keep the dismay from my voice. Claire, that's less time than I had before. It's consistent time, she countered. Guaranteed on the calendar. No last-minute cancellations. What about school functions, recitals, science fairs, sports events? She hesitated. We'll make sure you're informed about those. You can attend if you wish. I studied her face, noting the careful calculation behind her expression. This wasn't a peace offering. It was a business proposal. And in exchange for this generous visitation schedule, you'd like me to release funds for Abigail's conservatory. Tuition and Max's sessions with Dr. Levinson? I asked, not bothering to hide my sarcasm. Claire flushed. This isn't a transaction, Mom. I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. No, you're trying to give up as little as possible, while getting what you want, I said flatly. 5 hours every other week isn't being a grandmother, Claire. It's being an occasional visitor. What exactly do you want then? She asked, frustration edging into her voice. I want what I had before. Mondays and Fridays after school, regular phone calls with the children, inclusion in special events, the ability to take them places without supervision like any normal grandmother would. Claire's expression hardened. That's disruptive to their routine. They have piano on Mondays, and Max has his cognitive development sessions on Fridays now. Then Tuesdays and Thursdays or weekends. I'm flexible on the days, Claire. What I'm not flexible on is being treated like an outsider in my grandchildren's lives. We stared at each other across the coffee table. Two women locked in a battle of wills that was ostensibly about schedules, but really about so much more. About power, about family, about what constituted love. I'll have to discuss this with Peter, she finally said. Yes, please do. And while you're discussing, You might want to consider this. I leaned forward. The trust doesn't just cover tuition and therapy expenses. It's meant for anything that benefits the children's welfare and development. Piano lessons, summer camps, college visits eventually, even family vacations that have educational value. As trustee, I'll need to be involved in all those decisions too. Claire stood abruptly. This conversation is over. I came here in good faith, Mom. No, you came here to see how little you could offer while still getting access to the trust, I replied, rising as well. That's not good faith. That's negotiation. And if we're negotiating, you should know my terms aren't negotiable. I want a real relationship with my grandchildren, not a scheduled visitation. You're impossible, she snapped, gathering her purse. I'm their grandmother, I corrected. And I'm not going anywhere. After Claire stormed out, I sat back down, my hands trembling slightly. Confrontation had never been my strong suit. That had been Edward's department when necessary, his quiet authority often resolving conflicts before they escalated. But some things were worth fighting for, and my relationship with Abigail and Max absolutely was. My phone pinged with a text from Mark. Any news? Claire offered every other Saturday for 5 hours. I declined, I replied. Mark's response was immediate. Good. Hold your ground. The law firm I consult with says legally they don't have a leg to stand on. I wasn't sure if that was comforting or not. I didn't want this to become a legal battle. I wanted it to be a family reconciliation. But Claire's visit had made one thing clear. She saw this purely as a transaction, a power struggle to be won or lost. 3 days passed with no word from either Claire or Peter. I tried to focus on my hospital volunteer work, on my book club, on anything but the ache of missing my grandchildren. Then, on the 4th day, as I was sorting through medical supplies we'd collected for an overseas mission, my cell phone rang. It was from Abigail's school. Don't worry, I've got this, I assured him. Just keep trying to reach Claire. X-rays confirmed a fracture that would require a cast. Throughout the whole process, the examinations, the pain medication, the casting procedure, I stayed at Abigail's side, distracting her with stories about her mother's similar broken arm when she was 12, promising ice cream once we were finished. We were just leaving the hospital, Abigail sporting a bright purple cast and finally smiling a little, when Claire called. Where is Abigail? She demanded without preamble. The school said she's been taken to the hospital. She broke her arm during PE, I explained. We're just leaving the ER now. She has a cast and is doing fine. You took her to the hospital? Without my permission? Claire's voice rose. I felt my patience snap. Yes, Claire. I took my injured granddaughter to get medical care when neither of her parents could be reached. What would you have preferred? That she sit in the school nurse's office in pain for hours? You should have kept trying to reach me. I was in court. A court appearance more important than your daughter's broken arm? The words came out sharper than I'd intended, and I glanced at Abigail, but she was distracted by the nurse giving her care instructions. Claire fell silent for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was tight but controlled. Where are you now? I'll come get her. We're on our way to get ice cream as promised for being so brave, I said, softening my tone. Then I'll bring her home. She's had pain medication and is comfortable right now. Another pause. Fine. I'll meet you at the house in an hour. When we arrived at Claire and Peter's house, Claire was waiting on the front steps, her court attire replaced by casual clothes, her expression tense. She rushed to Abigail, examining the cast, asking about pain levels. Suddenly, every inch the concerned mother. The doctor prescribed pain medication, I explained, handing her the paper bag from the pharmacy. She should take it with food every 6 hours for the next few days. Abigail recounted the whole adventure with growing animation, particularly emphasizing the awesome purple cast and the triple scoop sundae with extra sprinkles that Grandma said I totally deserved. I noticed she was careful to call me Grandma multiple times during her story, her eyes flicking toward Claire's face with each mention. Claire listened, her expression a complex mixture of concern for Abigail and lingering resentment toward me. When Abigail paused for breath, Claire said, "Why don't you go show your cast to Max? He's been very worried about you." Once Abigail was inside, Claire turned to me. "Thank you for taking care of her today," she said stiffly. I should have been reachable. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from my daughter. I nodded, accepting it for what it was. "The hospital will send the bills directly to your insurance," I told her. "If there are any remaining costs, the trust can cover them. Just forward me the statements." "Of course," she replied automatically, then hesitated. "Would you like to come in?" Peter texted that he's on his way home, but it will be a while still. The invitation surprised me. Yes, I'd like that. Inside, I helped Abigail get comfortable on the couch, showing her how to keep her arm elevated on pillows. Max was fascinated by the cast, asking 1,000 questions and carefully drawing a small superhero on it with markers Claire reluctantly provided. It was oddly peaceful, the four of us together in their living room. Claire made coffee and even offered me a slice of lemon cake. We didn't discuss the trust or visitation schedules or any of the thorny issues that had dominated our interactions for months. We just focused on Abigail's needs and comfort. When Peter finally arrived, breathless and worried, he seemed momentarily taken aback to find Claire and me sitting together without obvious tension. "Thanks for taking care of everything," he said, squeezing my shoulder as he bent to examine Abigail's cast. "Mom handled it all," Claire said, and there was a new note in her voice, something that might, with optimism, be interpreted as respect. "Stayed through dinner. A simple affair of delivered pizzas eaten picnic style in the living room so Abigail wouldn't have to move." As I prepared to leave, Max wrapped his arms around my waist. "Can you come back tomorrow, Grandma? You promised to show me how to use the microscope you gave me for my birthday." I froze, uncertain how to respond. The microscope had been a gift 3 months ago, one Claire had deemed too advanced for him. Before I could form a diplomatic answer, Claire surprised me. "Actually, Max, I was thinking Grandma might pick you up from school tomorrow while I take Abigail to her follow-up appointment. Would that work for you, Mom?" I blinked, trying to hide my shock. "Of course, I'd be happy to." That night, as I drove home, I tried to make sense of Claire's sudden shift. Was it merely practical, needing childcare while dealing with Abigail's injury? Or had today's emergency given her reason to reconsider her stance on my role in the children's lives? Either way, it was an opening I intended to use. The next day, I picked Max up from his elementary school. His face lit up when he saw me waiting in the car line, and he bounced into the back seat, chattering immediately about his day, his friends, and the science project he was working on. "Can we set up my microscope right away? Joey says you can see actual alien monsters in a drop of pond water," I laughed, my heart full. This was the enthusiastic grandson I remembered, not the subdued child from recent visits. "They're not aliens, but they might look like little monsters. They're microorganisms, tiny living things too small to see with just our eyes." "That's even cooler," he declared. At my house, we spent a glorious afternoon setting up his microscope, preparing slides of pond water from my garden, and exploring the microscopic world. I showed him how to sketch what he saw, just as I had done during my medical training, and he filled pages with earnest drawings of paramecia and rotifers. "Mom says I shouldn't be a doctor because the training takes too long," he said suddenly, concentrating on a particularly detailed drawing. "She wants me to be a lawyer like her because you make more money faster." I kept my expression neutral despite the surge of irritation I felt. "Well, both careers help people in different ways, but you have plenty of time to decide what you want to be. What matters is finding work that makes you happy." Max looked up, his eyes serious. Were you happy being a doctor, Grandma? Very happy, I told him honestly. Even on the hardest days, I knew I was making a difference. He nodded thoughtfully and returned to his drawing. Later, as we prepared snacks in the kitchen, Max asked, "Why don't we get to come to your house anymore? Mom said you were too busy, but you don't seem busy." The innocent question caught me off guard. "I'm never too busy for you and Abigail," I said carefully. "I've missed our special times together." "Me too," he said, reaching for a cookie. "Mom and Dad are always busy with work and making us do extra classes and stuff. It's funner here. Claire." Arrived to pick him up at 5 o'clock, looking tired but less hostile than I'd expected. Abigail was in the car, her purple cast prominently displayed. "How was the follow-up appointment?" I asked. "The orthopedist says it's a clean break, healing well already," Claire replied. 6 weeks in the cast, then physical therapy. "The trust can cover the therapy," I offered. Claire nodded, then hesitated. "Mom, Peter and I have been talking. Given the children's current situations, Abigail's injury, Max's science fair coming up, we think it might make sense to revisit our arrangements." I kept my expression composed, though my pulse quickened. "Oh? We thought perhaps you could have the children on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, at least for the next few weeks while things are hectic, if that works for you." It wasn't a full restoration of our previous schedule, but it was a significant concession. "That works very well for me," I said simply. Claire's mouth tightened slightly. "About the trust funds? Why don't you send me the documentation for Abigail's conservatory and Max's sessions with Dr. Levinson?" I suggested. "I'll review everything and arrange for the appropriate disbursements." Relief flickered across her face. "Thank you. I'll email everything tomorrow." As they drove away, Max waving enthusiastically from the back seat, I allowed myself a small smile. It wasn't a total victory, but it was progress, an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that I belonged in the children's lives. The next morning, I received a thick envelope of documents via courier, enrollment forms for Abigail's conservatory showing quarterly tuition payments of $12,000, and invoices from Dr. Levinson detailing Max's twice-weekly cognitive enhancement therapy at $400 per session. I spent the morning carefully reviewing everything, noting that while the conservatory seemed legitimate and well-regarded, Dr. Levinson's approach raised some red flags. The therapy was described in vague, grandiose terms: neurodevelopmental optimization, cognitive acceleration protocols, with little concrete explanation of methodologies or expected outcomes. As a former physician, I recognized pseudoscientific language when I saw it. This warranted further investigation. I called Dr. Harriet Chen, a respected pediatric neuropsychologist I'd worked with before retiring, and asked if she'd ever heard of Dr. Levinson or his methods. Her response was telling. "Oh, Katherine, you're not sending a child to him, are you? He's what we call a status therapist. He tells wealthy parents exactly what they want to hear, that their average children are actually gifted but just need his expensive optimization to unlock their potential. Is there any validity to his methods?" Some basic skills training wrapped in expensive-sounding jargon. Nothing that a good school resource teacher couldn't provide for free. I thanked her and hung up, troubled by what I'd learned. Max was a bright, curious child who loved science and exploration. He didn't need optimization. He needed encouragement and freedom to develop at his own pace. This presented a delicate challenge. Simply refusing to fund the sessions would create another conflict with Claire. I needed a more strategic approach. When I arrived on Tuesday to pick up the children from school, I was surprised to find Peter waiting as well. "I thought I'd join you," he explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "The kids have been talking nonstop about the microscope and pond creatures. Thought I might learn something too." His presence changed the dynamic of our afternoon, not unwelcomely, but significantly. Peter had always been more laid back than Claire, more willing to let the children explore their own interests. As we examined new pond water samples and Abigail showed off her one-handed sketching technique, I noticed him watching the children with a thoughtful expression. "They're different with you," he observed quietly while the children were focused on their microscope. "More themselves somehow." "They don't feel judged," I suggested. "There's no pressure to perform or achieve, just curiosity and discovery." Peter nodded slowly. "Claire and I want the best for them. The best schools, the best opportunities." "I know you do," I said gently. "But best can mean different things." Abigail lights up when she plays piano because she loves music, not because she's training for Juilliard. And Max is struggling with all these extra sessions, Peter admitted unexpectedly. "He hates going to Dr. Levinson, says it makes him feel stupid, not smart." This was my opening. "I've been reviewing Dr. Levinson's materials," I said carefully. "As a medical professional, I have some concerns about his methods and claims." Peter looked surprised. "Really?" "His office is in that fancy medical building on Parkview, and he comes highly recommended by other parents at the school." Status and popularity don't always correlate with effectiveness, I pointed out. "Has Max shown any measurable improvement since starting these sessions?" Peter frowned. "Not really. Claire says these things take time, but would you be open to a second opinion? I have colleagues who specialize in child development. They could assess Max properly, see if he actually needs any intervention at all." He hesitated. "Claire is very committed to the Levinson program. The trust is committed to providing what genuinely benefits the children," I countered gently. "That includes seeking appropriate expertise to evaluate expensive treatments." Our conversation was interrupted by the children calling us to see something new they'd discovered under the microscope. But I could see I'd planted a seed of doubt in Peter's mind, one that might eventually bear fruit. That evening, after the children were collected, I sat down to compose a careful email to Claire. I approved the conservatory tuition for Abigail, without reservation, noting that her musical talent was evident and the program appeared excellent. For Max's therapy, I wrote that while I was approving payment for the current month of sessions, I was requesting a formal evaluation by an independent specialist before continuing funding. I attached Dr. Chen's credentials and contact information, noting that as one of the region's top pediatric specialists, her assessment would carry significant weight with educational institutions, a detail I knew would appeal to Claire's status consciousness. I concluded by reminding Claire that as trustee, I was obligated to ensure that trust funds were used for genuinely beneficial purposes, and that obtaining expert opinions was part of that responsibility. It was a calculated risk. Claire might see this as another power play, another attempt to assert control. But I hoped that by presenting it as a matter of proper fiduciary duty rather than questioning her parenting decisions, I might navigate these waters without triggering another storm. The response came the next morning, a terse email agreeing to the conservatory payments and acknowledging the need for proper documentation regarding Max's developmental services. Not an enthusiastic embrace of my suggestion, but not an outright rejection either. Progress, however incremental, was still progress. Thursday's visit with the children unfolded without Peter's presence, but with a noticeable shift in atmosphere. Abigail brought her music theory homework, asking for help with the mathematical aspects that were giving her trouble. Max chattered about his science teacher's praise for his microscope drawings. Neither mentioned Claire's reaction to my email, but I sensed a new ease in their behavior, as if some invisible tension had eased. As I helped them with their respective projects, I reflected on Edward's foresight. The trust fund that Claire had seen as simply a source of money for expensive programs was proving to be something far more valuable, a mechanism for ensuring balanced decisions about the children's upbringing, a counterweight to Claire's sometimes rigid vision of success. My phone pinged with a text message from Mark. Heard from Peter about the Levinson situation. Smart move. Claire won't admit it, but she's reconsidering. I smiled faintly. The path forward would still have difficult moments, but for the first time in months, it felt like we were moving in the right direction, toward a family where power was balanced, where different perspectives were valued, and where my grandchildren could benefit from all the love and wisdom available to them, not just the narrow version Claire had tried to enforce. By making me trustee, Edward had ensured I would always have a voice in our grandchildren's lives. It wasn't the relationship I would have chosen. I would have preferred love and respect without financial leverage, but it was a starting point from which something better might grow. The evaluation with Dr. Chen was scheduled for the following week. I'd expected Claire to insist on attending alone, but to my surprise, she asked if I would join them. "You have the medical background," she said, her tone practical rather than warm. "You'll understand the terminology better than I will." It was a small olive branch, but I grasped it gratefully. Of course, I'd be happy to be there. Dr. Chen's office was nothing like Dr. Levinson's sleek corporate suite with its modern art and ambient music. Her space was cheerful but functional, walls lined with children's artwork and bookshelves filled with well-used reference texts rather than glossy display volumes. Max seemed immediately at ease, drawn to the puzzle table in the corner while Dr. Chen spoke with us adults. Claire sat rigid in her chair, her lawyer's portfolio open on her lap as if preparing for a deposition. "I appreciate you bringing Max in," Dr. Chen began, nodding warmly at me before addressing Claire. "Dr. Bennett explained your concerns, but I'd like to hear from you directly about what prompted you to seek cognitive intervention for Max." Claire straightened. Max's preschool teacher mentioned he seemed occasionally distracted. His pediatrician suggested he might benefit from some focus training. Dr. Levinson's assessment indicated potential for enhanced cognitive function with proper intervention. Dr. Chen nodded, making notes. "And what specific issues have you noticed at home or school?" Claire hesitated. "He sometimes struggles to complete worksheets in the allotted time, and he has trouble sitting still during piano lessons." "He's 7. I couldn't help pointing out. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "Energy and variable attention are indeed developmentally normal at his age. Let me spend some time with Max one-on-one, and then we can talk more." The evaluation lasted nearly 2 hours. Claire worked remotely on her laptop while we waited, but I observed through the observation window as Dr. Chen engaged Max in various activities, some clearly assessments, others simply play. His face was animated, his body language relaxed, and eager. When we reconvened, Dr. Chen's expression was thoughtful but not concerned. "Max is a delightful child with a perfectly normal neurodevelopmental profile for his age," she began. "He shows particular strengths in spatial reasoning, scientific curiosity, and creative problem-solving. His verbal skills are above average, and his mathematical reasoning is on target." Claire frowned slightly. "But Dr. Levinson said—" "I can't speak to another practitioner's assessment," Dr. Chen interrupted gently. "I can only share what I've observed today, supported by standardized measures. Max doesn't display any cognitive deficits that would warrant intervention. What he does show is a learning style that thrives on hands-on exploration and real-world application rather than worksheet-based instruction." "So you're saying he doesn't need therapy?" Claire's voice had an edge of disbelief. "I'm saying he needs appropriate educational experiences that match his learning style," Dr. Chen clarified. "Forcing him into extended sessions of desk work or abstract exercises isn't playing to his strengths and may actually create frustration that manifests as inattention." Claire looked as though she'd been told the prestigious private school she'd selected had poor academic outcomes. "But all the other children in his peer group are in enhancement programs." Dr. Chen's gaze was kind but firm. "Education isn't one size fits all. Mrs. Wilson, what works for one child may be counterproductive for another." After we left, Claire was uncharacteristically quiet in the elevator. Max, released from the evaluation, was cheerfully describing a puzzle Dr. Chen had given him involving interlocking gears. "She said I have a mechanical mind," he announced proudly. "That means I'm good at figuring out how things work." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said, squeezing his shoulder. Claire remained silent until we reached the parking garage. "Max, wait in the car for a moment. I need to speak with Grandma." Once he was out of earshot, she turned to me. "Are you satisfied? Now we've wasted weeks of potential progress and thousands in already paid tuition to Dr. Levinson." "It's not a waste to learn what Max truly needs," I replied calmly. "And the trust can absorb the sunk costs if it means finding him appropriate support going forward." "And I suppose you're going to tell me I told you so," she said bitterly. "No," I said simply. "I'm going to suggest we both focus on what's best for Max now that we have expert guidance." She studied my face, perhaps looking for smugness or triumph, but found none. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. What do you propose instead of Levinson?" It was the first time in years she'd directly asked for my input on the children's upbringing. I chose my words carefully. Dr. Chen mentioned his aptitude for hands-on learning. There's an excellent STEM program at the Natural History Museum on Saturday mornings. Small groups, project-based, led by actual scientists. The trust could fund that instead. Claire frowned slightly, then nodded once. "I'll look into it." 2 days later, I received an email from Claire with Max's enrollment confirmation for the museum program attached. No accompanying message, just the document. From Claire, this constituted a significant concession. My Tuesday and Thursday visits with the children continued, gradually expanding to include occasional weekend outings. Abigail's cast came off, and she began physical therapy to regain strength in her arm. The conservatory director reported she was progressing well in her music studies, though she confided to me during one of our visits that what she really loved wasn't performance, but composition. "I like creating my own music," she explained, showing me a notebook filled with carefully notated melodies. "But Mom says composers don't make money unless they write movie soundtracks." "Your grandfather would have loved these," I told her, genuinely impressed by her sophisticated understanding of musical structure. "He played jazz piano, you know. He always said music was mathematical emotion." Her eyes widened. "I never knew Grandpa played piano." "There's a lot about him you never got to learn," I said, feeling a pang of sadness that Edward hadn't lived to see his grandchildren grow. "His piano is still at my house, in the music room. It needs tuning, but it's yours whenever you want to play it." The following Saturday, to my surprise, Claire brought Abigail to my house specifically to see the piano. She waited awkwardly in the doorway of the music room as Abigail reverently lifted the cover from the keys. "It was his grandmother's," I explained, watching Abigail gently press a key. "He had it restored when we were first married." "I didn't know Dad played," Claire said quietly. "He never mentioned it." "He stopped when you were about 10, I recalled. "Work got busy, and then you were taking lessons yourself." He said one pianist in the family was enough. Abigail was examining the sheet music still sitting in the bench compartment. Old jazz standards Edward had loved. "Could I—" she began hesitantly. "Could I come practice here sometimes? The conservatory pianos are newer, but this one feels special." Before I could respond, Claire surprised me. "I think that's a lovely idea. Maybe Saturday mornings while Max is at his museum program?" The look of delight on Abigail's face was worth every difficult moment of the past months. As April bloomed into May, our family's new rhythm began to feel established rather than tentative. My relationship with the children deepened as they realized I wasn't going to disappear again. Max brought his science projects for my input, and Abigail filled Edward's piano with music every Saturday morning. Claire remained reserved, but no longer hostile, occasionally even staying for coffee while Abigail practiced. Peter became an unexpected ally, often joining our Thursday outings and advocating for expanded visitation when Claire hesitated. Then came the evening that truly marked a turning point. I was working in my garden when Peter's car pulled into my driveway unexpectedly. He got out alone, his expression troubled. "Katherine, may I speak with you? It's important." We sat on the patio where the wisteria Edward had planted was just beginning to bloom. Peter declined my offer of coffee, fidgeting slightly, unusual for his normally composed demeanor. "What's happened?" I asked, concern growing. "Are the children all right?" "They're fine," he assured me quickly. "It's a financial matter." He took a deep breath. "Claire doesn't know I'm here." My instincts sharpened. "Go on." "We've been having some financial difficulties," he admitted. "The Parkview development has been delayed repeatedly due to permit issues. Cost overruns are eating into our reserves." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said cautiously. "But I'm not sure how I can help." He looked down at his hands. "The conservatory is demanding next quarter's tuition early due to some grant timing issue, and our insurance is suddenly requiring pre-approval for Abigail's physical therapy, which means we're paying out of pocket until it's resolved. The trust can cover those expenses," I reminded him. "That's what it's designed for." "I know," he said, still not meeting my eyes. "But there's more. Our mortgage has adjusted, and with the development delays," he trailed off. Understanding dawned. "You're asking for help beyond the children's expenses," he nodded, looking miserable. "Just a short-term loan. 6 months, maybe a year at most. Once Parkview is approved, we'll recoup everything." I studied Peter carefully. He had always been the more reasonable parent, the one who seemed to genuinely value my place in the children's lives rather than merely tolerating it for financial gain. But this request crossed a significant boundary. "Peter, the trust isn't structured for personal loans to parents," I explained gently. "It's explicitly for the children's benefit. Keeping our house, maintaining stability, that benefits them," he argued, though without much conviction. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. The figure he named made me inhale sharply. It was substantial, nearly a fifth of the total trust assets. "Does Claire know you're asking me this?" His expression answered before his words did. "She'd never agree to asking you for help." That complicated matters further. Not only was I being asked to potentially violate the trust terms, but to do so behind Claire's back. "I need time to consider this," I said finally, "and to consult with Mark about the legal implications. This isn't a simple request, Peter. We don't have much time," he warned. "Weeks, maybe." "I understand, but I need to do this right if it can be done at all." After Peter left, I called Mark immediately. He arrived the next morning, concerned and ready to help. "Legally, it's problematic," he confirmed after reviewing the trust documents. "The trust is explicitly for the children's benefit. Education, healthcare, enrichment, using it to bail out their parents' financial situation stretches that mandate considerably." "But if they lose their home," I pressed, "surely that affects the children negatively." "It does," he acknowledged. "But there are other potential solutions to their financial problems. Mortgage forbearance, loan restructuring, even selling the house and downsizing before foreclosure becomes necessary. The trust should be a last resort, not a first response." Mark leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's something else to consider, Katherine. If Peter is hiding the full extent of this from Claire, what else might he be hiding? How do we know the money would actually solve the problem and not just postpone a bigger crisis?" It was a painful question, but one I couldn't ignore. I had raised Claire to be honest and responsible, and I wanted to believe she'd chosen a partner with those same values. But Peter's secretiveness raised red flags. "What do you suggest?" I asked. "I think we need more information, the complete financial picture, not just the crisis Peter is presenting. And Claire needs to be involved. This affects her and the children too much to keep her in the dark." He was right, of course. Painful as it might be, this situation required complete honesty from everyone involved. I called Peter that evening. "I've thought about your request," I told him, "and I'm willing to consider it, but only under certain conditions." "Name them," he said eagerly. "First, I need full financial disclosure. All accounts, all debts, all investments, everything." "Mark has offered to review it confidentially." Peter hesitated. "That's a lot of private information, Katherine." "You're asking for a lot of money, Peter," I replied firmly. "Money meant for your children's future. This level of transparency is non-negotiable." "All right," he conceded reluctantly. "What else?" "Claire needs to be involved in these discussions," I said. "I won't go behind her back. This affects her and the children too directly." A long silence followed. "She'll be furious with me," he finally said, his voice small. "Perhaps," I acknowledged. "But marriages have weathered worse than financial difficulties, Peter. Secrets and lies are often more damaging than the problems they're hiding." After another pause, he agreed to my conditions. We arranged to meet at my house the following evening, all of us, including Claire. As I hung up the phone, I reflected on how dramatically our family dynamic had shifted in just a few months. The trust fund that had once been Claire's excuse to exclude me from the children's lives had become the very thing that might now force a new level of honesty and cooperation among us all. Edward could never have anticipated this specific scenario when he named me trustee, but perhaps he had understood something fundamental about family dynamics and human nature. That financial arrangements, properly structured, could sometimes open doors that emotion and pride had firmly closed. It was one of the most difficult family meetings I've ever experienced. Claire arrived looking confused and wary. When Peter finally revealed the extent of their financial troubles, her expression shifted from shock to disbelief to fury. "How could you keep this from me?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "All this time pretending everything was fine when we were on the brink of losing everything?" Peter had no good answer, just apologies and explanations that sounded hollow even to my sympathetic ears. Mark, bless him, steered the conversation back to practical matters. "The situation is serious, but not hopeless," he said, reviewing the financial documents Peter had provided. "There are several potential paths forward, some more painful than others." He outlined the options: mortgage forbearance, aggressive debt consolidation, selling assets, including possibly their home, or using a portion of the children's trust as a last resort. "Is that even legal?" Claire asked sharply, looking at me. "It's complicated," I admitted. "The trust is designed for the children's benefit, not as a financial safety net for their parents. Using it this way would require careful legal structuring and would reduce the funds available for their future education." "Then it's out of the question," Claire said firmly. "I won't rob my children's future to fix Peter's mistakes." Peter flinched at her words, but didn't argue. "There may be a compromise position," Mark suggested. "The trust could purchase a more modest home that the family would live in, with appropriate rental payments to the trust. That would maintain a stable environment for the children while preserving the integrity of the trust's purpose." This sparked a lengthy discussion about practical alternatives, what assets they could liquidate, what lifestyle changes they'd need to make, how they could restructure their finances to avoid complete collapse. Throughout it all, Claire remained coldly furious with Peter, but engaged constructively with the financial planning. For all her faults, she was pragmatic and resilient when faced with crisis. By the end of the evening, a tentative plan had emerged. They would sell their large house immediately, before foreclosure became imminent. The trust would purchase a smaller house in the same school district, which the family would rent at fair market value. Peter would seek professional financial counseling and commit to complete transparency about their finances going forward. And Claire would increase her legal caseload, taking on some corporate clients she'd previously declined. It wasn't an easy solution, but it was one that protected the children's interests while acknowledging the reality of their parents' situation. As they prepared to leave, Claire pulled me aside. "Thank you," she said stiffly, "for not simply handing over the money." When Peter asked, "For insisting on involving me." It was perhaps the most genuine moment we'd ever shared, an acknowledgement that despite our differences, we both prioritized the children's well-being above all else. "We're family," I replied simply. "All of us. We'll get through this together." She nodded once, then followed Peter to their car. The next weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Claire and Peter listed their house and began house hunting for a more modest home. I worked with Mark to set up the legal framework for the trust to purchase the new property. Throughout this tumultuous time, my relationship with Claire underwent a subtle transformation. The crisis had forced a new level of honesty between us, stripping away the polite fictions and power struggles that had characterized our interactions for so long. We still weren't friends. Too much history stood between us for that. But we had become genuine allies in navigating a difficult situation for the sake of Abigail and Max. Most surprising was Claire's decision to include me in telling the children about the upcoming changes. "You're an important constant in their lives," she acknowledged when I expressed surprise at the invitation. "They'll need that stability now more than ever." The conversation with Abigail and Max was difficult, but ultimately positive. We emphasized the advantages of their new situation: a backyard with space for a garden, bedrooms with window seats perfect for reading, a neighborhood with more children their age. Abigail had questions about whether she'd have to change schools, she wouldn't, and whether her grandfather's piano could move to the new house, it could. Max was primarily concerned about where his science projects would go and whether he could paint his room galaxy blue. "And will Grandma still come on Tuesdays and Thursdays?" he asked anxiously. "Absolutely," Claire assured him. "Some things won't change at all. Grandma will always be here for you both." The look we exchanged in that moment wasn't quite friendship, but it was something close to mutual respect, an acknowledgement that despite our complicated history, we had finally found common ground in our shared love for these two children. The moving date approached. I found myself reflecting on Edward and what he might think of all these developments. The trust he had established had served purposes he never could have anticipated, not just funding education and enrichment, but ultimately preserving family stability during a crisis, and, perhaps most importantly, forcing his daughter and me to include each other in the children's lives when we might otherwise have retreated to separate corners. Whether he had foreseen any of this was impossible to know, but I like to think he would approve of how his careful planning had ultimately brought the family closer together rather than driving us apart. The move to the new house happened on a bright Saturday in June. The modest colonial on Cedar Street had none of the pretentious grandeur of their previous home, but it offered something more valuable, a fresh start. I arrived early that morning with coffee and pastries, ready to help with the transition. To my surprise, Claire was already there, directing movers with calm efficiency. "Mom," she acknowledged with a nod, "the children's rooms are upstairs to the right. We've marked their boxes." It was the first time she had called me Mom instead of Katherine in years. I headed upstairs to find Abigail sitting cross-legged on her bare mattress, sorting through a box of books. "Grandma!" Her face brightened. "Did you see my window seat? I can read here and watch the birds in that big maple tree." We spent the next hour organizing her room, placing treasured objects just so: the collection of polished stones from our park walks, the framed photo of Edward at his piano, the watercolor set I'd given her for her last birthday. Max was more interested in exploring every corner of the new house than in unpacking. He darted from room to room, checking closets and cabinets, measuring doorways with his arms spread wide. "Grandma, my room has a secret," he announced breathlessly, dragging me across the hall. "Look!" He pointed triumphantly to a small door, built into the wall near the ceiling. probably access to some electrical wiring or ductwork. "What do you think is in there?" I asked, playing along. His eyes widened. "Maybe a map to hidden treasure, or a doorway to another dimension, or scientific equipment left by the last kid who lived here." I smiled at his imagination. "Well, whatever it is, it's lucky you found it." By evening, the essential rooms were functional. Claire ordered pizza for everyone, a gesture of unexpected normalcy that surprised me. We gathered around boxes serving as makeshift tables, eating from paper plates amid half-unpacked belongings. "A toast," Peter proposed, raising his paper cup of soda. "To our new beginning." We all raised our cups, even the children joining the simple ceremony. "And to Grandma," Max added, his face serious, "for helping us get a house with a secret door." Claire's eyes met mine across the makeshift table. "Yes," she agreed quietly. "To Mom, for more than just the house." It wasn't an effusive thank you, but coming from Claire, it carried significant weight. I nodded, accepting the acknowledgement, without requiring more. Later, as I prepared to leave, Claire walked me to my car, something she hadn't done since she was a teenager, eager to extend our conversations. "I understand now," she said suddenly, her voice low. "What Dad was doing with the trust arrangement." I looked at her questioningly. He wasn't just providing financially for the kids. He was making sure they had both of us in their lives, your wisdom and my drive, even when we couldn't see the value in each other. The insight surprised me, both in its accuracy and in Claire's willingness to acknowledge it. "Your father always played the long game," I said softly. "I've fought against your influence for so long," she admitted. I think I was afraid they would love you more." The vulnerability in her admission caught me off guard. "Oh, Claire, love isn't a competition. Children need all the people who care about them." She nodded, looking toward the new house, where Abigail and Max were visible through the window, arranging their treasures in this new space that represented not loss, but possibility. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said. As I drove home in the gathering twilight, I realized that the trust fund that had once been a source of tension and power struggles had become something Edward might never have anticipated. The foundation for a genuine reconciliation between mother and daughter, and the framework for a family that functioned not through obligation or financial necessity, but through mutual respect and shared purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.